Calvinists often reference these four basic proof texts to demonstrate their belief in divine determinism, sometimes referred to as Compatibilism. Genesis 50, where Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, Isaiah 10, the Assyrians used by God, Exodus 9, the hardening of Pharaoh, and Acts chapter 4, Christ's crucifixion. Check the show notes to see articles and videos on all of these. But for this video, the focus will be on Genesis 50, where Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers.
And now please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear.
This is a classic proof text used by compatibilists to establish their deterministic worldview. They mistakenly believe that God intending an evil event establishes their view and defeats ours. They erroneously conclude that provisionists, such as myself, would deny that God intends for some evil events to happen, such as the sale of Joseph or the crucifixion of Christ. For example, listen to this erroneous argument from Calvinistic apologist James White, as he fails to acknowledge that I believe God intended this evil event would take place.
You have absolute parallel. You have one act. It was an evil act, but it was intended by God. I don't know how you can get around this. You can sit there. Well, you're going to hear one way of trying to get around in a moment. So here is Leighton Flowers on Genesis 50:20.
Well, sure. I'd back up a little bit and look at the context of the text, because the original intent of the brothers was not to sell the brother into slavery. If you look through the narrative, their original intent was murderous. They wanted to kill him because of pride. They were jealous. Well, where does pride originate? Where does that come from? 1 John 2:16 says, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life comes not from the Father, but from the world. So whatever we conclude here, we cannot go against what Scripture teaches us and conclude that some eternal divine decree is the cause or the origin of these brothers' pride.
Notice that I am addressing the origin of the brothers' motive for wanting to kill Joseph. I am not yet even addressing the evil event of Joseph being sold. White fails to understand this argument. I have already agreed with my Calvinist opponent that God intended for the evil event to take place. But my argument is, proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines the motive or desire of all the parties involved in that event. In other words, God can intend that Joseph is sold into slavery without causally determining the pride and lust of his brothers, which motivated them in that evil event. Does James White address or even recognize this argument? Let's listen.
The first thing that is stated is, whatever this is saying, it can't be what he says it says. So my interpretation is the origin of pride is from the world, therefore it can't come from God, and therefore there is no divine decree. Do we recognize eisegesis when we see it? Do we recognize someone who, looking at the text, is going, I have overriding commitments that will not allow me to hear what this text is saying?
I do have a commitment to defend the character of God from those who attempt to suggest God decrees pride or lust. But White has pre-commitments too. He is committed to theistic determinism, i.e., God sovereignly brings about all things, including these brothers' pride. By the way, allowing Scripture to help us interpret Scripture is good hermeneutics, not eisegesis.
Text is saying, and since this text specifically presents the one divine truth that is the kryptonite to my tradition, and that is compatibilism. Because if compatibilism is true, if there can be one event that is sinful on the part of one and good on the part of the other, as Genesis 50:20 says, then the entire argumentation that he utilizes collapses. It's done.
Remember, I have already agreed that the evil event was intended both by the brothers and God. But remember my point of contention. Proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines the motive or desire of all the parties involved in that event. Calvinistic compatibilists do not only need to establish that God intended one evil event to prove their case, they must establish that God intends and determines all evil events and all the evil motivations of every creature involved. When Calvinists say, quote, God sovereignly and unchangeably decreed whatsoever comes to pass, end quote, do they mean all evil events and the motives of the evil creatures involved? Or do they just mean one evil event?
We have to come to a better conclusion than to impugn, I think, again, unintentionally, I think Chris's view impugns the character of God in that way.
So, the text says, I know, you keep going back to the text. The text says there's one event, the brothers meant it for evil, God meant it for good.
Again, we agree that God intended for that event to happen. We don't believe that proves God decreed the brothers' prideful motives, which is why God is just to still judge them.
Oh, you don't want to impugn God's character in that way. I'm not impugning God's character.
If you're contradicting 1 John 2:16 by suggesting the pride of the brothers came from God's sovereign decree rather than from them, then I believe you are impugning the character of God. I believe it would be unjust of God to causally determine the brothers' pride and then judge them guilty for pride. I do not believe it would be unjust of God to use them in their pride to bring about a greater good.
God is big enough to intend good through man's evil. That's what the cross is about. That's what Isaiah 10 is about. That's what Genesis 50 is about. Leighton just doesn't believe those.
That isn't true. I not only believe those passages, but I actually agree with what Dr. White just said about them. And apparently, he still doesn't understand that. Saying that God intends good through man's evil isn't uniquely Calvinistic. Saying God determines man's evil motives is. And that is the point of my contention.
And so what we would say, I'll give an analogy. For example, police officers.
We get an analogy. We don't get exegesis. We get an analogy.
Dr. White is setting up a false dichotomy by suggesting that Leighton either uses exegesis or an analogy. Could it be that I'm illustrating my exegetical findings by means of an analogy? And in order to avoid the argument, White resorts to a fallacy. Does Dr. White address the point of the analogy? Let's listen.
A sting operation where they know of notorious drug dealers in the area. They know their intention. They know that they're evil. And they don't cause, but they use the evil intention of criminals in order to bring about the selling of drugs at a particular time on Thursday at 2 o'clock in the warehouse so as to catch all the drug dealers in one place in the sting operation. So the police officers meant that selling of drugs, an evil crime, for a good reason, while the criminals meant it for a bad reason. So the same crime, the same act is being meant by both the police officers and the criminals. One is being meant for an evil purpose, for selfish gain. The other is being meant for a good purpose. And in the same way, in this scenario, obviously God meant what the brothers did for a good purpose, for redemption. So God's not redeeming his own determinations here. He's redeeming the brothers' bad determinations. He's bringing a good...
So notice, he's redeeming their bad determinations. He did not determine the same act. He's redeeming their bad determinations. That's not what the text...
Incorrect. I said God did determine the same act, just like the police determined the sale of drugs. Once again, Dr. White misses the point of my contention, and therefore never answers my argument.
Says. We've already demonstrated that. So he's changing the text in light of his analogy, in light of his overriding tradition. This is how tradition substantiates itself. It can't be derived from exegesis. This is eisegesis. This is Leighton Flowers eisegeting Genesis 50 in light of his tradition.
We could say the same thing of James White. We believe he is eisegeting this passage in light of his deterministic tradition, a tradition that's rooted first in Gnosticism, by the way. So let's be reminded of my point of contention. I believe it impugns the character of God to suggest that he determines men to act in pride and then judge them for doing so.
In God's ordering of his universe, the judgment for that act is based upon the intentionality of the will.
Notice that he says judgment is based on the brother's intentionality, and we agree. But who determined the brother's intentions on Calvinism? God. In summary, there are two underlying problems with the Calvinist claims about this passage. One, proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines all evil events that happen. Two, proof that God intends an evil event to happen does not prove that God determines the motive or desire of all the parties involved in that event. Therefore, the narrative of Genesis 50 cannot be used to uniquely support the theistic determinism underlying the Calvinistic system. Please like and share this video, and if you haven't yet subscribed, please click on the link in the bottom right corner. Also, remember to visit our website at soteriology101.com. Click on the support link in the top right corner to help us spread the news of God's love and provision for all people. Click on the Classroom link to learn more about how you can get a higher education at Trinity Seminary.